Hi there, Stephen here. I wanted to make what I hope is another helpful video. And specifically in this one, I want to cover how to go about getting Onspring report data into Power BI. And this is something I've seen admins want to do many times. And I thought, well, let me take some time and kind of investigate how you could go about doing this and how you could go about doing it in kind of an automated fashion. It's most definitely feasible to do it manually. You can export a flat file out of Onspring and then import it into Power BI. And the problem with that is your data set's going to have to be kind of manually upkept over time in terms of syncing what's in Power BI versus what's in Onspring. And really, I think what you want to do in this case is you really just want Onspring to kind of be your database or your data source. And you just want to be able to publish that same set of data from Onspring into Power BI so that Power BI users can use that data set to build visualizations or combine it with other data sets within Power BI. So um, while there isn't kind of a built-in way to do this within Onspring, there isn't sort of a Power BI data connector within Onspring, and in Power BI there isn't some sort of Onspring kind of templated way to query Onspring instances. Um, the best way to go about doing this is really leveraging kind of the two platforms capabilities. So on the Onspring side, Onspring offers an open API for customers that have instances. So if you have instances, you can use this Onspring API to get data and even put data into your given instance. And then on the Power BI side, Power BI has the ability to query data from a web source. So you can actually sort of use Power BI as sort of a REST client to make API requests against the Onspring API and then take that data that's returned in the API response and then transform that data into kind of your typical, table style Power BI data set. So that's what I'm going to walk through today. Again, I'm not a Power BI user, so maybe there's a better way to go about doing this, but this is what I've come up with, and I think it's rather straightforward. It requires a little bit of setup initially, but once you set up this kind of one time, it becomes much easier to reuse. So the first piece of this, we're going to do kind of the Onspring setup, and then we'll go over to Power BI and do the setup over there to get our query sorted. So what you see on my screen here is the report in question. So this is the report that I want to bring into Power BI. It's called All Records, and it lives in my Task V1 app. And that's the first piece of information we're definitely going to need is want to know what app this report is being pulled from. And then the other piece of information we can get from this screen is in the URL, and that is this numerical value here, this 1673 that's in the URL. That is the identifier for the report. That is the report's ID, and we're going to need that when we have Power BI send a request to the Onspring API to identify which report in the instance I'm wanting to get the data for. So now that we have those two pieces of information, we can move on to the next thing. But let me real quick, I'm going to keep track of this all in a notepad just so I can keep track of this. So the app in question for the report is Task V1, and the report ID is 1673. Okay, easy enough. So we've got that information. So now what we need to do is on the Onspring side or in the instance, we need to create a role and an API key that uses this role to be able to give to Power BI when Power BI makes a request to the Onspring API to say, I have the proper permissions, I have been properly authorized to get this data out of this particular instance. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create our role. So let's go in here and create a new role. And we are going to call this role, we'll just call it Tasks V1 Power BI Admin, something like that. We'll set it enabled, and then on the app permissions tab, we're going to want to find that task v1, and we're going to want to give it basically just the permissions it needs. So in this case, it really just needs to be able to read records or read data about records in this app. So I'll just give it read permissions. And then the other thing I need to do is I actually need to make sure that the user's app, that this role has permissions to read reference records in the user's app. And the reason for this is if I look at my report, so let me duplicate my tab here, and let's look at that report that I'm wanting to pull down here. So if I look at this report, you'll see I have this field, or this column here. That's an owner field that is a reference to the user's app. So in order for my query from Power BI to be able to see this field, the API key I give to Power BI needs to also have the ability to see the field. So that's why I need to make sure that that user's permission is set as well, and that's the case for any maybe reference field that you have in your report. You need to make sure that the API key or the role that you give to the API key has the ability to see all the data in the report. That's important. Okay, so let's go back over to this role. Now that we've got the right permission set, we'll go ahead and save it. Oh, it's already taken. Okay, so this is going to be demo. Go ahead and save it. Okay, now we'll go to our API keys, and we're going to go ahead and create a new one. So we'll call this task B1 admin. Let's actually call it Power BI admin, something like that. We'll go ahead and save it. And then we're going to give it that role that we just named. So this is going to be that demo role. And then the piece of information we want to take from the API key is on the developer information tab. So this is this API key value right here. So we want to go ahead and copy this. Now, I am showing you my API key on screen, but I'm going to delete it after I make this video, so don't get too excited. But best practice, don't share your API key with anyone, right? Treat it like a password. So let's go ahead and copy that. We'll stick that in my notepad over here, API key. And then we can also take this API URL, because this is the URL we're actually going to need when we're sending our API request from Power BI. So I'll go ahead and take that too. So this is kind of the base URL. Okay, so now that we have the report ID, we have the proper API key with the proper permissions, and we've got the URL, the endpoint of the Onspring API. Now what we need to do, or I guess the last piece of Onspring information we need to do, is we need to understand what endpoint on the API we need to use to get report data. And the best place to get this information is at api.onspring.com/swagger. So this is documentation that Onspring provides. It's also an interactive page, so you can actually use this page to test the Onspring API, just as a side note. But this gives you a list of all the different endpoints that are available and kind of how to use them and what they return and what you need to send. So if I scroll down here, there's a section for reports. And we can see there's one here, there's an endpoint here that says get the reports for the provided report ID. So that's the one we're going to want to use. So let's go ahead and copy that endpoint format. I'm going to put that in my notepad over here. So that's my endpoint. And I can see I need to provide that endpoint with that specific report ID. But I can also see there's some other parameters I can send, some query parameters I can send, as well as a header value. So this accepts, there's two versions of the Onspring API, so I can actually specify what version I want to use. In this case, I want to use version 2, so I'll specify that. So let's go ahead and add that to my notepad too, because we'll want to use those in our Power BI query too, to make our query a little bit more robust and reusable. So we'll say API headers, and we can set the XAPI version header, and then API parameters. We can set the API data format parameter, and it looks like that parameter can accept either a raw or a formatted value, and then this data type parameter too only accepts these two parameters. So this parameter allows you to determine how the data that you receive back from Onspring is formatted, and then the data type parameter allows you to decide, do you want the reports report data, or do you want the reports chart data? So in Onspring, you have the ability to configure charts and do some aggregation of data and some aggregation, some calculations to aggregate information using a chart. And so if you wanted that chart data, you could get that back as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just add again that to my notepad. So for reference, when I'm building my Power BI query, I have that information. So data type, and that's going to be report data or chart data. Okay. All right, so that should cover us on the Onspring side. Let me just bring this over into your view. So this covers all the information we should need from the Onspring side. So we've got the report ID. We actually don't really need the app for the Power BI side. So we've got our report ID. We've got the API key we want to use. Again, treat this like a password. I'm showing it to you here. You don't do that. I'm going to delete mine after this. We've got the base URL, so where we need to send that request, the endpoint on that URL that we need to tack on, and the report ID value, we've got to enter that. And then we'll send some headers. So we'll send not only the API key as a header, but we'll also send the version as a header from Power BI. And then we've got some query parameters that we can send to kind of change what we get back from Onspring depending on our needs. So now that we've got that information, let's go ahead and open Power BI. And let's get a new file set up here. Taking a minute. Here we go. It opened on my other screen. One sec. Okay, here we go. So now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and save this. I'm going to save this to my desktop, and I'm going to call it Onspring Report to Power BI Demo. Go ahead and save that. Okay, so the easiest way to get started in Power BI here is to go ahead and click this Get Data option, and then we're going to choose to get data from the web. And this is going to bring up a modal that initially looks very simple. So it just asks for the URL. So where on the web should I go and try to pull data from? But because our endpoint, or the URL we're going to use, requires authorization, meaning it requires us to pass that API key to kind of prove, hey, we're properly authorized to get the data from this particular place, we need to switch over to the advanced side. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to build up the request that Power BI is going to make to the Onspring API. So we're going to go ahead and stick in that base URL to start with, right? So every request has to go to here. And then we're going to tell it that it needs to hit this particular endpoint. This is that reports ID endpoint. And then we're going to want to change this report ID token here. And we're going to actually want to put the right report ID value, 1673. And then down here, you'll see I have these fields that I can use to provide headers for the request that Power BI is going to make. So in this case, I want to provide the X API key header. And the value for that is going to be my actual Onspring API key. And then the other header we're going to provide is that version header. Just so we're being very explicit. Onspring can actually handle the request without it being set there, but just to be very explicit that we are using the second version of the Onspring API. And so what should happen now is when I click OK, Power BI is going to send a request to the Onspring API, and if I've set everything up correctly, I should get a response back, and the response that comes from Onspring will be in JSON, but Power BI will take that and display it to us in a little bit more user-friendly way. So let's go ahead and click OK. Depending on how much data you're bringing back, this may take longer. For me, it should be pretty quick. I think I've just got like 8 records in this report. So it should open up the Power Query editor now. And again, like I said, the response will actually be a JSON, an array. I think it's an array. Yeah, it's there's an object. Let me see. Let's look at the Swagger documentation. Oops. Yeah, so it's an object that has a property or a columns field and a rows field, and then the columns field is an array of the field names of the report, and then the rows is an array of objects that contain the record ID for that particular record, and then a cells property which contains an array of values for the fields in that report for that particular record. But Power BI kind of does a nice thing for us where it puts it in this kind of view where we can see it in sort of a list view where I can see a list of the field names, or in this case for the rows I can see a list of the records, and then I can go into each record and I can see the record ID, and I can see a list of all the different individual field values for that record. So that's basically, kind of the starting point. We're getting data from Onspring, and now we're putting it in Power BI. And then from here, you can use kind of Power BI's typical transformation tools to get this data into, a data set, table style data set that users, Power BI users, would be more typical or comfortable with using to build visualizations. Before, though, we go through kind of the steps that I think are the easiest to get the Onspring data into that table style, I want to walk through making this query reusable, right? So making it parameterized, making it reusable, and then also making it so that it works correctly when we publish this to Power BI. And I'll touch on that in just a second. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some parameters. And this will allow us within Power BI to basically have some fields in our query where we can just put the information we need to make this request to Onspring by basically just entering sort of form data, right? They'll just be fields that we can put the API key in, we can put the report ID into. And what that'll allow us to do is very quickly or very easily change what the query is asking for from Onspring. So the first thing I'm going to put here is the API key parameter, and this should just be text. You can make these required if you want. I'm not going to for the sake of just convenience of being able to leave them blank. I'm also going to add a parameter for the report ID. All these should be text-based, so text, and then it can be any value. Another one, this is the parameter for the API data format, so this can be either raw or formatted. So again, I'm going to set this to text. And instead of any value, I'm actually going to say a list. So this will just make kind of a drop down that you can pick from. So I'll just do raw, formatted, and then I'm going to set this to the default value of raw. And then the last one I'm going to add here is data type. And I'm going to set this to text. And this is going to be a list of values, which is going to be report data and chart data. So our two options, and we'll set the default value to report data. We'll click OK. Oh, what did I do? Oh, I left that as required, so that shouldn't be required. And click OK. And so now I have these parameters that I can enter, and you can see Power BI makes me kind of basically just, it's basically just form data here, and I can use the values I enter here almost like variables in my query. So let's go ahead and navigate back to this query, and I'm just going to rename this so we know what it's doing. Get Onspring report data. Okay, so then I'm going to open up this query in the query editor. So I'm going to click Advanced Editor here. And so now I can kind of see what Power BI here is doing. So Power BI is basically passing some information to this web contents so that this web contents can go and get that source data. And then we're indicating it's going to be, we're expecting it to be a JSON document. And we're going to take that JSON document and we can be able to kind of display it as a record view, but then we can transform it. But that's going to be where our source is coming from. So what I want to do is I want to modify how we're building up this web contents call, and how basically just how we're building that. So what I'm going to do is, instead of this being kind of concatenated here, what I want to do is I actually want to remove this part of the request. And the first parameter I pass to the web contents, I just want it to be this static URL. And this is important because when we publish this to Power BI actually looks at this source and it looks to see, is this being put together dynamically? And if it is, it won't allow us to do automatic refreshes, which isn't helpful because that's kind of one of the powers here we're trying to get at, basically putting this data set in Power BI to where we can automatically update it and keep it in sync with Onspring and allow Power BI users to use the data set in their visualizations or in the analysis they're doing. So we're going to leave this static, and what we're going to do now in the second parameter, which is this array, this is basically an options array where we can pass some things to this web contents method, and then the web contents method will use that to further build out this request. So I'm going to go ahead and format this a little bit. So let me hit return. I'll bring this down here. Bring this down here. It's a little easier to read. Okay, so now we've got this headers option that we've set. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to modify this. Instead of it being a hard-coded API key, is we want to actually reference the API key parameter that we just made. So we're going to stick that there. And then we want to add some options here. So the first one is we're going to add the relative path option. And you may say, well, how do you know all this, Stephen? I just looked at the documentation for the web contents method and figured out what options I could pass, and here we are. So what I want to pass here for the relative path is the other part of this URL that I need. So I can't just send the request to this URL. It has to also have that reports ID and the specific report ID value on the end of it for me to make the proper request. So that's what this relative path will do, is it's going to, when this request actually gets sent, it's going to append this relative path, which is reports ID, reports /ID / and then we'll tack on the end of it that specific report ID value, which is coming from that parameter that I just made over here. So all these values that I'm referencing are these parameter values that I'm referencing over here, and Power BI will know that just by entering the name. So then I've got the report ID here, and then the next option is this query option. So when this request gets built, you can pass an array of key value pairs that Power BI will add to the end of this relative path. So when it's all said and done, this request is going to look like this. It'll say https /api.onspring.com /reports /ID /1673. And then what the query option does is it allows us to tack on these query parameters that we can use to modify the request, or that Onspring tells us we can use to modify the request. And so we can tack on something that says data type equals report data, and data API data format equals raw. And the way we can pass that piece of the URL is in this queries array. So we can say report data, should be data type equals data type. And this data type on the right hand side is referring to the parameter over here, this parameter. So it'll dynamically populate that. And then the next value in this array is going to be that API data format option, and that will be equal to the API data format parameter. And so now when when Power BI goes to build this request and send it to Onspring, it'll do it in a much more dynamic fashion. It'll allow us to quickly reuse the query or modify the query just by changing the parameters in the query, and then also it'll allow us to publish it to the Power BI service, and we'll get access to that ability to automatically schedule refreshes. So let's go ahead and click done, and note initially this isn't going to work. When I click done, my query is going to be broken. You see it says we cannot convert the value null to type text. The reason for that is all these parameters are empty. So let's go ahead and populate them with the values that we originally had and that were hard-coded. So there's my API key value. My report ID value is 1673. I'm going to pick a data format of just raw, and I'll pick my data type of report data. And when I do this, you'll see my query is going to update down here below, and now I've got that response that I expected. And you can even see, if I look at this query, right, you can see this is the query it used, but when it actually sent the request, it replaced all these parameter references with the values that I actually entered in those parameter fields. And so now if I wanted to, like if this actually had some chart data, I could change this to the chart data, and Power BI will go and get, instead of the report data, the chart data. You'll see if I do this, I actually break the query again because I don't have any chart data for this particular report. But it kind of illustrates why we're parameterizing this query. Is one, I can change it, modify it to my needs very quickly, and get data back from Onspring. But it also makes this kind of reusable. I can make this same setup in another query or another Power BI file and get another Onspring report. The other thing I like to do at this point is, now that I've parameterized this query, is I can right click on this query and I can say create function. And what this will do is, I'll call this get Onspring report data, is it'll make me a function that I can invoke as many times as I want to generate a query that aligns with what I want to get from Onspring. So now I can just enter. So for example, I can just make the exact same query without having to build all those parameters again. I can just enter my API key, enter my report ID, enter my data format, enter my data type. And now when I invoke this, Power BI will make me a new query, and you can see in this query, it's referencing that custom function and it's passing those parameters, those text parameters, and I'm getting back the same response. And so now I've got this very reusable query, and I could take this to other places. I could get multiple reports from Onspring without having to rebuild all these different parameters and naming them different things, and just doesn't require all the same level of setup, right? So the initial setup to do this the first time takes a little bit, but then afterwards on the Power BI side, all I need to do is provide the right API key, the right report ID, and the right format information, and boom, I'm ready to go. All right, so let me go ahead and delete this. And now that we've talked about parameterizing this query, making it reusable, let's go ahead and talk about how I go about transforming this this data that we get back from Onspring into our actual data set that we want to publish or we want to share. So you'll notice here we do have this columns list, which provides us with the list of the field names. You can think of these as the column headers for your data set in Power BI. I don't really use this list. You could have two different queries, one query that goes and gets this list, another query that goes and gets the record data and sort of merges them together so that you could make kind of you could build the columns of your data set more dynamically. I think it's a little bit more work than what it's worth. So what I typically do is I just handle the naming of my columns manually, because I figure reports in Onspring are pretty static. And so if you add a field to your Onspring report or remove a field from your Onspring report, say you do that a couple times, 3-4 times in a year, it's not a big deal to just go and update your query and publish it again with the updated version. That's my personal opinion. If you want to do it in a more dynamic fashion, go for it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click into this rows list. And now I've got a list of the records. And so I'm going to convert this to a table. And I don't need to delimit it on anything. I just want to get the individual column. So I've got this column now of records, and I'm going to go ahead and expand this to two columns, a record ID column and a cells column. And then in this cells column is actually individual field values for that record, right? So this is my name field, my due date field, owner field, status field, and description field. So what I want to do is I actually want to extract these values from the list here. And I want to delimit this on a comma. And we'll see if this works. This has actually been giving me an error. I don't know why Power BI is giving me an error here. But I know why. I don't know why, though, it's behaving this way. Is when it generated the transformation step to actually extract the values, for some reason, it's not putting that comma delimiter here. So if I add this manually, and you may not have this issue, but if I add that comma manually and rerun that step, you'll see here I get what I expected, which is that same list that was there, but now it's separated by commas. So I've still got my name value, comma, due date value, etc. And now what I'll do is I'll take this column and I'll split the column by a delimiter, and I'll pick comma and each occurrence of the delimiter. I'll click OK. And now what that'll do is it'll break that comma separated value into individual values and individual columns. And then from here, this is where I just go through and do my manual renaming of the field. So I'll just go ahead and manually rename these to what they are in Onspring. And again, yes, you could do this more dynamically. It just doesn't seem worthy having to do two separate queries, then merging the two separate queries together and doing some pivots and transforms. So in this case, I'm just, I just think it's easier to, when I update Onspring report, I'll update this query to account for whatever fields I added or removed. So I'll go ahead and rename those. And description. And so at this point, I have that table data sets that most people are used to working with when they're doing visualizations within Power BI. So I'll go ahead and click close and apply. And so now when Power BI opens this file back up, it's going to make that query, make that request to Onspring. It's going to bring back that data. It's going to put the data through those steps that I did in my transformations. And now when I go over and look at my data sets here, I have this table. It's got my record ID, my name, my due date, my owner, my status, my description. And now I can start using that to, build visualizations, right? So if I wanted to just kind of start with something basic like some sort of table, I can do that, right? So there we go. And then if I want to go into Onspring, let's say this is just to illustrate the connection or the request is working properly. Can't get my window to open down here. If I go back over here to my report and click create content, and let's say do thing 9 test, give it a due date, Ian Perkins, status not started. I'll go ahead and save that. So I'll go back to Power BI. So now I should have another 9th record when I refresh this data set. So let's go back over here. Let's refresh this data. Refresh data. And now I should see, it's making that request in the background. I get my 9th record, and that 9th record will show up in my visualization too. Now, the real power here, though, is why we spent all that time modifying our query, making it more parameterized, making sure that it didn't have a dynamic source, or Power BI doesn't think there's a dynamic source there, so that I can publish this. So, right, we want to be able to have kind of this data set in Power BI that's synced with Onspring, right? Onspring is kind of our database, our source, and Power BI is just kind of holding a version of that so that people can use Power BI's visualization tools to interact with it. So I'll go ahead and publish this to Power BI. And so what this will do is this will save the file locally, but then it's going to push it to the Power BI service, which is kind of I guess you can think of it as kind of the cloud version, right, of Power BI. And so it should take a minute here. And then now it says success. So now if I open this up, I can open this up on the Power BI service. And I can see here that here's the visualization that I made, right? So I can see that here. And if I wanted to create other visualizations from this data set, I could. But what I want to point out is if we go to the data hub here, we can find that data set we just published. And if we navigate to the settings, we can now set this up so that it automatically refreshes, so we don't have to manually refresh it here. It'll just refresh on some sort of regular basis. So if somebody uses this to build, a dashboard or some reports here, this data set will update, maybe once in the morning or maybe several times throughout the day, and that dashboard that somebody built will reflect what's most up to date. So I'll first go to the data source credentials and click edit credentials. And the important thing to point out here is you always want to set the authentication method to anonymous, and then you want to pick the privacy level that's appropriate for your use case. In this case, I just selected organizational. And then you really want to make sure you select skip test connection. If you don't skip this, then when you click sign in, it's going to fail and give you an error. And the reason for that is because when you try to send a request to api.onspring.com, there's really nothing there. It doesn't actually, have anything to say back to you. What you need to send is you need to say api.onspring.com/reports/ID. You need to hit the right endpoint on the API to get a response. And so you want to be able to actually do that within the query, or we've set this up to actually do that in the query that we published, right? So the query that we built will handle all that correctly, but right now this modal isn't aware of that. So we'll go ahead and click skip test connection. That way we can go ahead and sign in. And so now we don't have to worry about that validation step. And now when our query runs, it'll send the right API key header. It'll make sure all that authorization is taken care of because we already put that in the query. We built that properly in our query. And now what we'll be able to do is we'll go down to scheduled refresh. We'll turn this on. We can select a time. We'll say daily at 8 a.m., right? That makes sense first thing in the morning. You could add more times here if you wanted to. We'll click apply. So now each day at 8 o'clock, the Power BI service will send a request to Onspring API. Give me the data that's in the report right now, send it back, and the data set will be updated to reflect that. And just to show this working in the Power BI service, if I go back to the Data Hub and I look at this data set, let's just create a formatted table really quick. So if I create a formatted table and I add to the fields here, some fields here, you'll see I've got, 9 records in here? 1, 2, 3, 9 records. And if I go back over to Onspring, and let's make a copy of this, so we'll add another record here to the report. So now there should be 10 records in Onspring. All right, there's 10 items in Onspring. So now if I go back to Power BI, right now it still says 9. Now if I refresh the data here, so let's go ahead and manually refresh it. Now again, with the scheduling functionality, this would just automatically happen. But to illustrate that it does refresh properly, I'll just go ahead and manually refresh it. And so this refresh value will update to now 1225. And if I head back over to, or if I create another formatted table really quick, and I add some fields, you'll now see I've got 10 records here. So you'll see I've got all 10 records. 1, 2, 3, yep. So all 10 records are here. So it's that the Power BI service is using that query that we built properly to request the data from Onspring and then display it. And so now because we scheduled that automatic refresh, it'll be updated, and the data set published here to Power BI will be in sync with the data set that's actually in Onspring. Okay, this was a little bit of a long video, and if you stuck with it, 40 minutes, I appreciate it. It does require a little bit of setup to make this work between Onspring and Power BI, but the tools are there and it does work, and it's not excessively complicated to get started. And then once you have this setup done and you want to query another report, it doesn't require all that effort because we have that function we made, right? We've got this function that we have here in this query, and we could just reuse this function, whether it be in this Power BI file, whether it be in this Power BI file or some other Power BI file. We can just reuse that query, particularly this aspect, right, and those parameters to repeat this, right, to make this modular in essence. So I hope this was helpful. I will mention there is a limitation to this approach when it comes to report data. If you're trying to bring back a report that has 500,000 records and 100 fields, more than likely you're going to run into an issue with timeouts. So it's just going to take so long for Onspring to process that amount of data and send it back to you that it's going to exceed the timeout limits, and so you won't be able to actually call back that report. And in that case, you'd have to use a little bit different approach where instead of using the report endpoint of the Onspring API to get that data, you'd probably need to use the records endpoint, which is a little bit different approach, but you can still do it. And I plan to follow up with another video, kind of another write-up or demo of how to go about doing that in case you ever do find yourself needing to load that type of data set from Onspring and publish it into Power BI. I'll likely have a demonstration for you. So if you're interested in that, keep an eye out. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next one.